True Crime Brewery contains disturbing content related to real-life crimes. Medical information is opinion based on facts of a crime and should not be interpreted as medical advice or treatment. Listener discretion is advised.
Welcome to True Crime Brewery. I'm Jill.
And I'm Dick.
This story of Tina Fontaine's life belongs to her and her family, but it parallels many others in the Indigenous communities. Her struggle for stability, the promises not kept, and the sexual exploitation she endured meant that Tina experienced more trauma and pain than most people could even imagine. Because of situations beyond her control, Tina needed housing, health, and educational services that were not easily accessed. In the last years of her life, poverty, homelessness, and drug use led her into life-threatening situations on an almost daily basis. All of this by the time she was 15 years old. Today at the Quiet End, we're telling Tina's story. After all, Tina was just a girl. She was a girl with hopes and dreams, just like our daughters. But Tina was left vulnerable to dangerous predators. Why was no one able or willing to protect and defend her? Let's talk about it. And what do we have for a beer?
I'm comping out a little bit. The beer is a beer from Quebec, not from the western provinces. But I like the name of the beer, La Fin du Monde, the end of the world. I thought it was fitting for this tale. And I truthfully haven't been able to get some samples of beers from the western part of Canada. So, La Fin du Monde it is. It's brewed by Unibrew in Chambly, Quebec, Canada. It's a Belgian triple. A little weighty at 9% alcohol by volume. Very, very nice beer. Cloudy yellow, small white head, maybe a hint of lace. Spice and fruit aroma. Taste was citrus fruit, a little more spice, tangy spice, and it was kind of warming as you drank it. Nicely carbonated beer, very good to drink. But I'm a big Unibrew fan anyway.
It sounds really great.
It is. I think you'll enjoy it.
Fancy bottle as well.
A little bit.
It's got the cork.
I know, but I don't think you're supposed to equate corkage with quality.
I do.
I mean, this is a high-quality beer from a high-quality brewery, but it doesn't always follow that way.
Yeah, but I've never opened a Budweiser with a cork. Never.
And you never will.
So, right. So it does kind of equate with a fancier beer.
True.
At least as a layperson.
If you look at it that way.
Yes. Well, let's open it up. Dickie, follow me over here to the quiet end of our spare bedroom, which is our pandemic quiet end.
It is.
And let's start this story.
Okay.
A lot to talk about here.
We have a fair amount to cover today.
Well, because Tina is one girl who's an example of something that happens to a lot of girls, and it's an issue. So it's definitely something I'm really happy that we're able to address today.
Yeah, and it is a timely topic.
Yes. And it should be about time, right?
Right, it certainly should. So to understand the context of Tina's experiences, we first need to understand that she grew up in a family plagued for generations, literally generations, of family fracturing, domestic violence, addiction, loss, and systemic racism. Her father was a member of Saugeen First Nation, and he was a survivor of the Canadian residential school system.
Yeah, now I had never heard of these residential schools until I started researching this topic. And these residential schools are really this historic thing that was set up, I believe, in the 1950s. There was a lot of it going on. And just so much abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, of course, a poor education, not enough money for supplies, and not surprisingly, most of the kids that went to these schools didn't get good jobs or go to college or even finish school. Yeah, and this was something that was put on the Native Americans.
Yeah, I mean, the way you're describing it, it's a formula for failure.
Absolutely, and nobody cared. And this goes all the way back to the colonization of North America.
Now, Tina's father left Sag King when he was just 12 years old, often living on his own on the streets of Winnipeg. And his struggle with alcohol actually began in his early teen years.
Which wasn't unusual. 12, 13 years old, an alcoholic.
Yeah.
Shocking, right?
Not there.
No. Kind of the norm, which is really terrible.
So Tina's mother was from the Bloodvein First Nation. When she was 6 years old, Child and Family Services was brought into the home because Tina's maternal grandparents had a violent relationship that was escalated by drug addiction and alcohol abuse. So in 1992, Tina's mother was in state custody. She was found to be sexually exploited from a very young age. And by that, we mean that she had a pimp.
Well, not always that. I mean, sometimes the parents, relatives.
Okay, but she was being passed around.
Yes.
And CFS did nothing to stop it. And when she was still a child, again, literally, she began using alcohol and drugs.
As a coping mechanism, I would imagine. I just can't imagine the environment that these children grew up in.
Well, and coping and also to dull the pain of what's going on.
Well, yeah, that's what I would put that in the category of coping.
Okay.
Dulling pain would be part of the coping process. But in 1994, Tina's mom was just 12 years old, and she was in a sexual relationship with a 23-year-old man. And this man would be the father to Tina and 2 of her 7 siblings that she would eventually have. So documents would show that the Child and Family Services workers were aware that the 12-year-old was having sex with a grown man and that this man had a history of violence. Her files contain notes about Tina's mother running away from foster homes to stay with him. Evidence of sexual exploitation were documented, but little was done to intervene. So this is in spite of the fact that the age of consent for sexual activity was 14, which is super low anyway, right?
I can't imagine. Is that still the law, or the age of consent in Canada?
Well, only if the sex is with someone that's no more than 5 years older. So if it's with someone 19 or younger, yes.
I can't believe that. Jeez.
But this situation was an 11-year age difference.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a no-brainer. But
Yeah.
I'm still, maybe I'm not amazed.
But this, is to an extreme. And Tina's mom admitted to being sexually exploited by other adults as well. She was earning money and buying alcohol for herself and for Tina's father by, giving sex to strange men or even sometimes men in the family. It's very warped. Before her 13th birthday, Tina's mother told the CFS worker that she was depressed and suicidal. And she was quoted saying, "The streets are my only friend." Just think about that for a minute.
Well, just think about a 13-year-old saying that.
I know, right?
Right?
Now, Tina herself was born on January 1st, 1999, and she was her mom's second child. And her mom was only 17 when Tina was born. And also, Tina's mom was still a ward of the state when she had these 2 children. And Tina's dad was close to 30. He was about 28 years old at that point. Before Tina was born, there is evidence that her parents were trying to improve their lives and become good parents. They did take parenting and prenatal classes, and they were in addiction recovery programs. At the hospital, it was decided that there were no concerns with this family, and Tina was allowed to go home in her mother's care. But then 6 months later, Tina's mother aged out of foster care, and then she lost some of her services, and they kind of lost touch with her.
So Tina's father fell back into addiction and domestic violence by the summer of 1999. Tina's older sibling ended up in the custody of a foster family, but Tina's mother did request scheduled visits. Then in June 2000, Tina's mother gave birth to her 3rd child. Now, Tina's parents planned to raise Tina and the 3rd child with CFS support services. The 1st child remained in foster care, and this was under a permanent order. Read that and I figure, She's never going to be living with her folks, with her parents.
No, but why her and not the other two? So here we get into fractured families.
Yep.
When Tina was 1 year old, she was removed from her parents' care for the first time. She and her 4-month-old sibling were held in a hotel and then returned after just 4 days. In 2001, Tina's mom and dad were separated, and the two children lived with their father and paternal grandmother. 3 months later, the children were moved again and held in a hotel for 9 days. Then they were placed in foster care. After their father completed an assessment through the Addictions Foundation of Manitoba, the children again lived with him and his mother. And Tina's mother was in a new relationship by this time, and she gave birth to a 4th child in 2002. That December, she was pregnant again. There's no documentation about any agencies taking any steps to reunite Tina's mother with her older children. And maybe that's justified, we just don't know. But it just seems like a big mess.
It does. I mean, nobody seems to know what the other person's doing.
Exactly. And I feel like Tina's mom and dad had grown up in similar situations, so having a child in foster care probably wasn't that strange for them.
Right.
It's just something that happened in the community.
In 2004, Tina and her younger sibling, were living with their father in Winnipeg, and then he got a diagnosis of cancer. So her father placed the two children with his great aunt in Sagking, and this was through a private guardianship agreement. They seemed to have a loving home with their great aunt, whose name was Thelma Favell, and a great uncle. Tina would call them Grandma and Grandpa.
And that's how we'll refer to them for the rest of this story. Just makes it easier. So Tina was in the 1st grade in the 2005-2006 school year. Tina's grandma reported that Tina was hyper, and she suspected that she may have fetal alcohol syndrome. She was having difficulty with reading, writing, and math, and received extra help. She continued to live with Grandma and Grandpa and did okay in school, and she was noted on her report cards to be quiet, shy, and not always as attentive as she should be.
In 2011, Tina's father died from a head injury. He had been out drinking with 2 other guys, and an argument broke out, and he was assaulted and had the head injury. Tina was 12 at that time. She had been living with her grandma for 7 years. But her father had come to the house for Sunday dinners, and he continued to maintain contact with Tina and her younger sibling. So her father's death had a pretty huge impact on Tina. Now, Tina's mother reached out, and she had weekly phone calls with Tina, and this was after having no contact for several years, like 2004, so 6-7 years, no contact. Then out of the blue, after the dad dies, she's there for Tina, but this only lasted a couple months. And then her mother stopped calling, and her phone was disconnected. So this probably didn't help Tina, right?
No, more hurt and abandonment for her.
I would think.
Now we have to remember Tina's mother is very troubled and has addiction problems from a young age. So she's really in no condition to raise children, which is really sad. She didn't have much to offer her daughter. But Tina transferred schools after being bullied and teased about her father's death, and she did well for a while. She was promoted to the 8th grade for the 2013-2014 school year. Her first term report card showed that Tina had missed 9.5 days of school and had not completed all of her assignments, so she quickly went downhill. Then the school social worker noted that Tina was really distancing herself from her peers, so transferring schools hadn't fixed the problem.
No, but how much help did they get?
Well, it was sporadic and disconnected help.
Yeah.
That's a big problem here.
I mean, this sounds, after the death of the father and the school transfer, that there's some depression going on, obviously.
Well, yes, and the communication between social workers, school, CFS, the police is just not good.
So when Tina started running away from home, this was in October of 2013. Social worker contacted Tina's grandma, but she didn't really have an idea how to help Tina.
Well, remember, this great aunt grew up in the same kind of circumstances.
Right.
So although she was a good-hearted person who definitely loved Tina and her younger sister, she didn't know what to do.
Well, I think she was limited.
Absolutely. And there's no record of the school contacting Child and Family Services with these concerns, even though Tina's grandma had passed on these concerns to them. And Tina was missing a lot of school.
Yeah. Well, there's probably a lot of these situations. I mean, I'm not trying to defend CFS or anything, but you know how overburdened and overextended they are.
And this is unfortunately the norm.
Yeah, it is.
Really.
So on November 4th, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police called the CFS intake agency for Winnipeg about a missing 14-year-old, Tina. The RCMP said that Tina had run away from her grandmother's home and was believed to be in Winnipeg living with her mother. Now, Tina's mother already had CFS involvement in her care of Tina's younger siblings. So the agent wasn't comfortable leaving Tina in her mother's custody, so they requested that the Winnipeg police pick her up.
And they did. They went to Tina's mother's home and picked up Tina. And her mother was drinking. There were multiple visitors there when they arrived, and Tina was asleep in another room. Tina's grandma was contacted to come and get Tina from the agency office after the police took her there, but the grandma had no transportation. So Tina was held in a youth shelter overnight, and she was picked up from the shelter 2 days later by her grandpa. That's how long it took him just to get transportation.
Yeah. But nothing comes easy for these folks.
God, I know, right? Everything is just a struggle.
Yeah, and just
has to wear you down.
Grinding poverty.
Right. So child welfare had no further dealing with this family until April of 2014. So there was no follow-up. That was just kind of it. She went back to her grandma and grandpa's. Case not closed, but certainly not acted upon. Then on New Year's Day of 2014, Tina turned 15, and later that month, she was in an argument with her grandma, and she cut her own forearms with a pen. Paramedics were called, and Tina was taken to the Pine Falls Health Complex, and Tina said during her interview with a nurse that she'd never self-harmed before, and she was not suicidal. So hospital staff didn't notify child services, and no social worker even met with Tina or her grandma. And the health complex would say, well, they didn't have a social worker on staff. So, passing the buck again.
Sorry, screwed up. And then Tina would continue to miss school throughout the 8th grade. She was absent for 47 of 64 days, and because of this, received multiple incompletes on her report card.
And what I think about is, where was she all these days, It's not good.
Well, I'm sure she wasn't in a good situation.
No, not at all.
And you would think, here it is, 8th grade. I mean, she's absent. She's doing all sorts of stuff. And even though this kind of behavior seemed to be getting worse, the school didn't reach out for child and family support services. Tina had applied for victim services after her father was killed, but she wasn't getting any of those either.
Yeah, there were special services for, children who were victims of trauma, by losing her father in a murder. But these services never worked out. And we'll talk more about that as we go on, as to why that happened. But on April 16th of 2014, Tina was suspended from school for being under the influence of marijuana. Now, here's one of the things that's always bothered me. If a kid's doing something like that, skipping school, using drugs, how are you going to punish them? You're going to give them some days off so they can do more of that? Drives me crazy that they do that. There should be a better way. Detention, more supervision at school, something. But just washing your hands of the kid for a few days does nothing to help the situation or to help Tina.
Right, but it helps the school.
It's easy for them. And I'm sure it's not just the people working at the school, it's a matter of funding.
Oh, yeah.
Because you need staff if you want to supervise the children. You don't need any extra staff to just let her go on the streets for a few days.
Nope.
And this time was noted to be her second offense, but no first offense could be found in the file. So whatever happened then, we have no way of knowing. But Tina's grandma was asking for help with Tina. She reported that Tina was not going to school at all anymore, and she was feeling like she just couldn't safely manage her at home. She was, calling out for help.
Yeah, and 11 days later, Tina's grandmother called the CFS agency again to ask if Tina could be placed in care for her own safety. Grandma was worried about Tina because she was using drugs and she was trolling with adult men on the internet.
Yeah, and it wasn't unusual. It isn't unusual for child predators to be on the internet, and it's pretty easy to lure a girl like Tina out of her house. It doesn't take much.
It wouldn't take hardly any effort.
So when an intake worker called Tina's grandma back that same day, she was told that Tina was missing from the home and that this was not the first time that she'd run away. The Winnipeg Police Department sent an officer back to Tina's mother's house to see if she was there, but Tina wasn't there either. So she's missing. Tina's mother's CFS worker was contacted, and this worker told Tina's intake worker that Tina's mom's 2 youngest children were recently removed from her home. So if Tina had run to her mother's house, this was absolutely not considered a safe place for her.
You wouldn't think.
So that evening, Tina's grandma learned that Tina was safe with some other extended family members in Selkirk. Selkirk is about 15 miles from Winnipeg, and it's down near the Red River.
So Tina remained in Selkirk, and her grandma and grandpa met with a CFS worker in their home on April 29th. The report from that day included concerns that Tina was not going to school, that she was in communication with men, and she was running away from home. Tina's grandma was also concerned about Tina's self-harming behaviors. So a community mental health services referral was recommended. Tina, as we had mentioned, had never received counseling after her father's death, and she is showing some behaviors now which put her at pretty high risk.
I can't think of much higher risk for a child than what she was going through. And Tina's grandma didn't have legal guardianship. Remember, it was just an agreement with Tina's father, who's now deceased.
Right, but there is a blood relationship. It's not like she's living with some unknown person.
Right, and she does have custody.
Yeah.
So she was allowed to make some decisions for Tina because of her customary care provider status. And an assessment was done, and Tina was decided to be at moderate risk. So this is just based on paperwork. I don't know how you come to that, because I definitely would see her at high risk.
I don't know how you say moderate risk. Jeez.
I know. I'd hate to see what high risk would be. But there was a note also in her file from that day that read that she was at high risk.
Okay.
So whoever had done this assessment certainly saw it that way.
Good. Although it didn't make any difference.
Not really. I mean, I'm sure a lot of these people were trying hard to help her. But it's just the system is not working.
Tina returned home and met with a caseworker on May 6, 2014. She discussed her problems at school and said she was interested in meeting with a counselor. But the issue of Tina interacting with men on the internet and her vulnerability to sexual exploitation by these men were not addressed at this meeting. And obviously there was no plan made for her safety because of this issue either. Hadn't been discussed.
Which is pretty shocking.
I know. I mean, I would think it's part and parcel of what you're getting ready to do, right?
Yeah. And this is what's happening to these women, these girls, right? So it's something that should be really at the top of their list of things to worry about. But in June of 2014, Tina was referred for counseling. On June 17th, Tina's grandma updated the CFS worker about how Tina was doing, and she was making some improvements, but still really struggling with her father's death. But the problem is this counselor she was referred to was 75 kilometers from her home, and these are people who don't have a car. The worker would later say that gas vouchers were offered, but Tina's grandma didn't remember those being offered, and she said that if she had been offered those, she would have absolutely accepted them. So the plan was for Tina to eventually see a counselor closer in Winnipeg. But getting Tina seen there was really difficult too, because the counselor that did these kind of cases for these clients only did it 1 day a week.
Tough to fit them all in.
But you're familiar with this, not to this extreme, but it's really hard to find counselors and psychiatric help for children.
It's horrendous. Mental health is a huge, huge issue. And if you talk to any pediatrician or family practice person that sees kids, they will all tell you the same thing, that we're all doing far more psychiatric work than we're really trained to do.
Right, because you're prescribing antidepressants for kids.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We were doing things because there was no way to get the child seen in a timely fashion.
Right, and that seems to be all across the country.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you can imagine here it's even worse because the services here are very limited.
Well, you got this whole kind of perfect storm. Got a population at risk. There's so many problems going on. It's almost an insurmountable task. Kind of like, well, where do I start?
Well, and yeah, I imagine myself if I was a CFS worker. I think I'd get discouraged after a while, and I hate to admit it, but I think you'd lose some of your passion and just feel kind of like, how much can you really help? I mean, of course you're going to do what you can do, but you're not going to feel very empowered.
No, you'd feel pretty unempowered, and you get burned out.
Well, that's another thing. I think it would be hard to keep people in these positions because it would really bring you down.
It would. June 27th, Tina was accused of throwing a rock through a screen door window. Tina's grandma was not informed, and no further information on that incident has ever been released. Then on July 10th, Tina's grandma received an alarming Facebook message from Tina's boyfriend. Tina had recently gone to visit her mother. Now, this had been a planned visit when her mother seemed to be doing better. Now, Tina's boyfriend had seen Tina and her mother using crack cocaine and had seen Tina being sexually exploited. Tina's mother didn't have any of her children living with her by this time. She was into drugs again and spending time with what could be only nicely said as really shady people.
And Tina's mother really had no problem having her daughter have sex with men for drugs, because that's how Tina's mother grew up.
Well, and if she gets the drugs, what's the goal here? Give me some drugs.
I know, it's incredibly sad.
Whatever means works.
Yes. So even Tina's boyfriend wanted nothing to do with that, and they had an argument about that. And this was a boyfriend, she had a couple younger boyfriends who she wasn't having sex with. So, a decent kid. So Tina's grandma called Tina's intake worker, who contacted Tina's mother's worker and left a message telling her that Tina's grandma was really concerned about Tina's mother's drug use escalating and Tina getting involved in it. The grandma wanted Tina to come back to her and to get help. So what she was told to do is to go file a missing persons report.
Well, that's a big help.
I know.
They had an interview done with Grandma, and she explained that Tina had made improvements in school, and she had agreed to allow her a week-long visit with her mother. Now, Tina's younger sibling had absolutely no desire to visit their mother.
Yeah, for some reason, her younger sister Sarah seemed to have a little more common sense about this. And maybe it's because she hadn't been through as much. She'd been with the grandma and grandpa from a younger age and probably had a little more security in her life.
Yeah, maybe.
So between June 30th and August 17th of 2014, Tina was reported missing at least 5 times. The last report was on August 9th, and then Tina's body was found in the Red River 1 week later. That morning, divers were actually looking for the body of someone else, someone named Farron Hall. Farron was a local hero who'd walked to the river's edge, undressed, folded his clothes into a neat pile, and then waded into the river, and that had happened 2 days previously. He hadn't been seen since. So the story of Farron is an interesting one, too. He was a homeless man, and he was made famous in 2009 when he rescued a teenaged boy who had fallen from a bridge into the river. Farron had dived into the freezing water and saved the boy from a strong current. And a few months later, he saved a drunk woman who'd fallen in. So for these efforts, he was given some money and a medal, and he even donated some of his money to a homeless shelter. So even though he had a very rough life, he wanted to help others. But Farron didn't enjoy the fame that he got from this. It caused some good responses, but also some very bad responses. He was beaten up a few times, and he continued to struggle with his own alcohol and drug addiction. Like many Indigenous men, Farron had a very rough upbringing. His mother died when he was a young child, then his sister was murdered. So he was living in a tent along the riverbank. On the day that he walked into the river, it really isn't certain if he was planning on taking his own life, but he was seen soon after flailing in the strong current and being pulled beneath the bridge. So they knew that he had died in the river. But during the search for Farron, this is when searchers came across Tina's body. A man and his son were looking for a spot to fish when the man saw something partially submerged in the water's edge. And as he moved closer, he saw it was a human body, a tiny human body wrapped in a tan-colored blanket. Then he was hit by that terrible odor of death and decomposition, and he saw swarms of flies. Fortunately, he'd had his son stand back, so he ran away from there, took his son, and they called 911.
So police dive teams rushed to the site to take care of the body. As they came across the decomposing bundle, a crew member had to work hard to free it from the reeds that it was kind of hung up in. The material that Tina's body was wrapped in was knotted, but one of her arms was exposed. And the people who were looking at it or found her knew right away that this was too small a person to be Farron Hall. There was an autopsy. It was performed by forensic pathologist named Dr. Dennis Reed. He had recently moved to Winnipeg from California. And that's a weird movement, huh? I wonder if he's Canadian to begin with?
He must have had some connections there, but it was really fortunate because he was experienced.
Yeah, he had a lot of experience. He'd worked on more than 100 homicides in California. So he began by taking photos of the knots that held the bundle together. And as he removed the material from the body, he found several rocks that weighed about 11.5 kilograms altogether.
So how many pounds is that? I always forget the conversion, approximately.
25-ish, 2.2 pounds per kilo.
So it wouldn't be enough to hold a body under for very long.
Not for long. I mean, it'd be maybe enough to help hold it down for a time, but not keep it down.
No, although she was tiny. Now everything inside of that material, of course, was covered with Green River mud. But after looking more closely, the pathologist saw a leaf pattern on a double-layer duvet cover that had buttons and eyelets along one edge. So this would become important in the investigation of Tina's murder.
Now, Dr. Ree noted that the body belonged to a small, young female. She was 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 73 pounds.
So, really tiny and underweight, right?
Not so tiny, but for sure underweight.
Yeah, the height's okay, but 73 pounds at 5'3" is very thin.
Anorexically thin.
Yeah.
She was wearing a short skirt, a t-shirt with Born to Rock written on it, a bra, underwear, and pink high-top sneakers. Because there was a moderate amount of bloating of the body, it was estimated that she'd been in the water for some time between a few days to a few weeks. You couldn't identify the face because the skin had all been kind of sloughed off. So if you're looking at photos of missing girls, you'll never be able to tell who it was. But there was a tattoo that was still intact on her back between her shoulder blades. It was Eugene Fontaine, that's her father's name, with the dates 1/3/1970 to 3/30/10/2011. And on either side there were outlines of angel wings.
Right, so those dates are in Canada, so you have the day before the month.
Right, so March 1st to October 30th.
Right. Dick, why are you smashing your headphones to bits?
I am just so frustrated listening to ads. Why can't I listen to my favorite podcasts without those annoying ads?
Well, I can't help you with other podcasts. However, True Crime Brewery now comes commercial-free for our Tie Grabber members.
Huh?
That's right. If you subscribe at any level, you get to listen to all of our new episodes commercial-free. And this is in addition to our bonus episodes each month. Plus, you get some great TCB swag mailed to you when you join.
At least I can listen to True Crime Brewery ad-free. I really wish other podcasts would do that. And Jill?
Yeah?
Do you know where the glue is? No, I just pounded up my last pair of headphones.
In the Missing Person Unit's files, the name of 15-year-old Tina Fontaine was found. She'd run away in July, and she'd been listed as missing several times, as we know. And the report noted that she was the daughter of Eugene Fontaine, who'd been killed in 2011. So this tattoo pretty much confirmed her identity. An X-ray of her entire body showed no broken bones. Dr. Ree was unable to determine the cause of death, and the manner of death was undetermined. So just a reminder, the cause of death is the specific injury or disease that causes the death, and the manner of death is the determination of how the injury or disease leads to death. So I always have to remind myself of those two.
Oh, yeah, well, it's always good to recognize that.
Yes, because it makes a big difference. But later that evening, Farron's body was discovered in the river just 8 kilometers from where Tina had been found. So finding 2 bodies in one day definitely made the news. But Farron's death was not determined to be due to foul play.
So after notifying Tina's family, the police scheduled a press conference for the next morning. There were 6 teams of detectives assigned to Tina's case. So for the conference, a poster of the most recent known photo of Tina was put up on an easel at the front of the room. In the photo, Tina looked very young and innocent, more like a 12-year-old than a 15-year-old. The plan for the detective in charge, who was Detective John O'Donovan, was to explain the facts of the case. But O'Donovan was surprised by how emotionally affected he was by Tina's murder. The comparison of the cute picture of a teen girl to the autopsy photos was just incredibly disturbing.
Yeah, but as he spoke, his passion for this case was noted by a lot of people that it was very unusual. Usually these types of things were very matter-of-fact. So he did get very emotional. He got up there and he said, "This is a child that's been murdered. I think that society would be horrified if we found a litter of puppies or kittens in the river in this condition." Now, unfortunately, in Winnipeg, the press had grown accustomed to hearing about dead Indigenous youth, but this was coming across as different. The detective was being emotional and making his point that this crime should be unacceptable and that society needed to be outraged.
He pointed out how small and vulnerable Tina was. She'd been exploited and murdered and dumped like trash into the river. Before this, the typical press conference's message was that runaway girls like Tina were killed because they followed a high-risk lifestyle, which is just a way of saying, well, we're not going to be working too hard on this case. But this time it was different. A police officer was talking about Tina with empathy, as if she really mattered.
And this caught the attention of a lot of Indigenous people, because this just hadn't been the case for years. Years and years.
Many.
Way back in the 1970s, 19-year-old Helen Betty Osborne from the Norway House Cree Nation was picked up by 4 young white men when she was walking home. The men had been looking for an Indian girl to have sex with, and she was forced into their car, driven to an isolated spot, sexually assaulted, and stabbed more than 50 times. She could only be identified by her fingerprints because she was so disfigured by this attack. And it took 16 years for 3 of the 4 men to be charged with Helen's murder. And in the end, only 1 of them was convicted. So how much justice is that? I think it's sorely lacking.
Well, you know it is. Now, since Helen's death, many more Indigenous women have been killed in Manitoba. In 2003, cousin of Helen's, 16-year-old Felicia Solomon Osborne, told her mother that she thought a car was following her as she walked home from high school. A few weeks later, she went missing. Then more than a week had passed before the police interviewed Felicia's mother. And then it took months for the police to issue a press release.
So just think about that. The mother calls and says, "My daughter's missing, a high school student," and they don't even come out to talk to her for a week.
Yeah, we're really busy, ma'am.
Then we have months to issue a press release. Then about 1 month after that, body parts identified as Felicia's began showing up around the Red River. She had been dismembered. The media suggested that Felicia had been involved with the sex trade and was using drugs. But that wasn't the case. Her mother denied this, and there was absolutely no proof of that. And her murder has never been solved.
Then, 5 years later, after Felicia disappeared, another Osborne cousin disappeared. Claudette was a 21-year-old woman. She had just given birth to her fourth child, and she was living in one of those low-budget hotels. As it happened, there was a long-distance trucker stalking her and trying to have sex with her. Now, after she disappeared, the detectives did eventually track down the truck driver. They never found any evidence in his truck, and the police told Claudette's sister to let the issue go because the man had a wife and family. Holy shit.
What a slap in the face. And this is 3 girls in one family.
Just one family.
And that's not unusual. There was actually a 4th Dick. Hilary Wilson was 18 when she went missing from her home in Winnipeg in 2009. And her body was found on a dirt path outside of the city a few days later. Now, I mention these Osborne women because they represent just a small example of a big problem throughout Canada. In the 3 decades before Tina's murder, more than 120 Indigenous women were murdered or disappeared in Manitoba. In 2014, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police gathered national figures, and these estimated that about 1,200 Indigenous women had been murdered or had disappeared in Canada just between 1980 and 2012.
Now, the Native American Women's Association of Canada collected their own statistics, and these showed closer to 4,000 Indigenous women missing or murdered over the last 40 years. When you consider that only 4% of Canada's female population are Indigenous, and almost half of the murdered women in Manitoba were Indigenous, you've got some startling numbers there.
Well, and you have to think, there must be some of these girls who never even get reported missing.
Oh, you know that.
They have nobody looking out for them. On the day Tina's body was found in the Red River, her grandma was still looking for her. She had contacted the police multiple times and had reported her missing and in danger of being exploited. She learned from a Facebook post that a body had been pulled from the Red River, and the next day 2 Royal Canadian police officers came to her house. So she knew it was something bad, and they broke the news to her.
Toxicology testing of Tina's liver and chest fluid found a moderately high blood alcohol level, but some of this could have been due to decomposition of her body. Even if it was accurate, it wasn't enough to cause her death. Tina's fluids and liver were positive also for cannabis, but negative for cocaine, crystal meth, and opioids. Cause of death was undetermined. But obviously, the way her body was found, homicide had to be suspected.
Well, yeah, and I would think the way she was found, you would just assume homicide, although I guess you can't do that. But if someone's hiding a body and weighing it down, it's not a natural death.
It sure isn't.
So still without an actual crime scene, there wasn't a lot to use for this investigation. The duvet cover was saturated with mud and organic debris. It needed to be washed to be processed, but that could interfere with preserving evidence. So in the end, it was decided that they would wash the outside and save any evidence on the inside. So once the outside was clean, the duvet was determined to have been once white or beige. It had a pattern of leaves in gold, brown, and rust running along the bottom edge, and then going up the center. 29 individual hairs were found, as well as 4 kinds of fibers in the colors red, black, and then red and blue. Once examined, though, the hairs had too little biological material, so with disappointing forensic testing results, investigators turned to that duvet cover.
Yeah, they first needed to find out where the duvet cover had been sold. Now, the manufacturer's label identified it as coming from Costco, Canada. Fortunately, this is a members-only store, and they kept a record of everything that had been bought there. Now, the barcode showed that it was a queen-size duvet in a pattern called Chloe Green. So they're going to look this stuff up. It's going to be a pretty labor-intensive task, but it may be able to lead to a suspect.
They're very hopeful that it will.
Yeah, now, making this even more difficult was the fact that the barcode used for the Chloe Green cover was also used for 3 other designs. and the records couldn't differentiate between the patterns. So between February 2013 and August 2014, Winnipeg's Costco stores sold 864 duvet covers in the 4 patterns. Now, there were another 29 duvet covers that were labeled surplus, and they'd been sold at a discount store. So that's almost 900 duvet covers they're going to try to check out.
It's a lot of canvassing that's going to happen.
Holy cow.
But the owners that they contacted were mostly very helpful. Purchasers sent pictures of their covers with the day's paper lying on them to save them from having to go out to their homes. And some pictures arrived from other countries, actually, from around the world. Out of all the duvets found, only 100 that had been purchased had this Chloe green pattern, so that helped. And 89 people were able to show the police their duvets. 5 said they'd returned theirs to Costco. 2 had given them away to the Value Village thrift store. So detectives went out in pairs to canvass these people and look for the duvet covers. They're hoping to be able to match somebody who would be a suspect.
Right. So while all this was going on, Detective O'Donovan began to interview Tina's friends and family. In the weeks after she had run away and was living in Winnipeg, her relatives had not tried to convince her to return home to her grandma. They were all aware that Tina had run away, but none of them took her in or even tried to make her return. So we've got a problematic family here.
Absolutely.
One family member said that Tina and her mother had argued because her mother was trying to push her into sex work.
God, I know that woman's had a hell, but I just can't imagine doing that.
How do you do that to your kid?
Something's missing there.
Another relative was accused of human trafficking for forcing another young woman into prostitution. Tina's relatives gave her a place to stay overnight, gave her some food when she was hungry. But that was it. No one offered her anything that had any permanence at all to it.
Yeah, so she's just going through life with no home base. Detectives did look into Tina's 2 known boyfriends. Larry Dumas had known Tina for about 5 months, and they had broken up because Tina wanted them to sell drugs together, and he said no. Then she started dating a boy named Cody Mason. Cody was 18 years old, he was Indigenous, and he was from the Northern Manitoba Reserve. But he'd been in the city over the summer to help his father recuperate from an auto accident. Cody had checked in for a flight back to the reserve on August 6th at 6:26 a.m., and since the last confirmed sighting of Tina was after August 6th, Cody was not a suspect. Following Tina's whereabouts before her disappearance, detectives learned that she was in a youth shelter, and this was between July 23rd and July 26th. Then she returned to the shelter for about an hour on July 27th and again on July 28th. Then, in a note from July 30th, the shelter's file noted that Tina was absent the night before. She didn't return, so she lost her placement. Staff did call hospitals looking for her, and after 24 hours, they filed a missing persons report. Then Tina's grandma heard from one of her grandchildren that there were nude photos of Tina online. She called the Winnipeg Missing Persons Unit to inform them of these photos, and a CFS worker tried to contact Tina's mother, but her phone was disconnected. The Winnipeg police said that they did search social media and didn't find the photos. They tried to contact Tina's grandma, but then Tina's grandma's phone was disconnected. So Tina and Cody had showed up at the youth shelter on August 1st, and there was no place for her. But Tina said that was okay, she was staying at her uncle's house that night. Then on August 2nd, she did contact her CFS worker. She said that she'd be staying with her boyfriend for a few days. She said that she wanted to be placed somewhere where she feels like it's home. Tina was told there was a bed for her at one of the youth shelters, and Tina said that what she would do was ride her bike over there. So she was left to find her own way to the shelter that night. So here she is, a missing child. She makes contact, and instead of going and getting her or having the police get her and take her to a shelter, they're going to let her ride her bike there. But, not surprisingly, Tina didn't make it to the shelter that night. The next day, Tina called the shelter and said she needed a place to stay. And now she was told that the shelter was full, but that if she did come to the shelter, they'd try and help her contact her worker to find some kind of placement. So Tina didn't show up. She didn't show up on the 5th or the 6th. A missing persons report from July 31st was still in effect, but no one at the shelter had gotten a location when they talked to her and reported to the police where she was, even though they had spoken with her.
And even though the missing persons report was in the books.
Yes.
So the last time Tina was seen by youth shelter staff was August 8th, 2014. Tina and a female friend arrived at the youth shelter together. Tina identified herself as Tessa Guimond and said that she lived with her mom, Robin. She denied having any involvement with CFS. Now, she was noted to have a swollen lip and scratches on her knees. She told the staff that she had tripped over a skateboard and hit her lip on a table.
Yeah, but Tina's friend, who was worried about her, and she spoke with a staff member in private, and she told them, this is really Tina Fontaine, but Tina denied using an alias. So Tina was allowed to leave the shelter, and she left with her friend in the middle of the night at 3:30 a.m. What a mess.
What a mess. And at 5:15 in the morning, that same morning that she left...
Yeah, just a couple hours later, really.
The Winnipeg police pulled over a vehicle in central Winnipeg for failure to use a turn signal. The records show that the person driving had a suspended license. The officer smelled alcohol on the driver's breath, and he was argumentative. There was a young female in the car, and initially she said her name was Tessa Tuhart. Then she eventually admitted that her name was Tina Fontaine. The car was impounded, but 2 police officers let Tina go, despite her having a missing persons report on her. What, did they not know?
They didn't check.
Okay, so they didn't know because they didn't check.
And this would become a big deal. They would be disciplined because this was just outrageous negligence.
Well, I would think. The Winnipeg police policy requires officers to return Tina to her assigned placement. So they didn't do that. And they also didn't ask if she was being sexually exploited by the driver of the car.
Right, but later we'll find out that she was.
Yeah.
And just a few hours after her interaction with the officers, around 10 a.m., Tina was found unconscious in an alley near the University of Winnipeg. So here's what happened. They let her go, and she was unconscious in an alley. This area was known for sex workers to be exploited there, and Tina was unclothed from the waist down, and they couldn't wake her up. So they called 911. I guess it was the university's security guard who made that call, and Tina was taken by ambulance to the hospital. And once she woke up, she told the paramedics that she'd been with a man, and she had used alcohol, cannabis, and some other drugs. She was very confused, and she had blisters and burns on her lips. So I don't know, is that like a crack cocaine thing? I'm not sure. But she did test positive for amphetamines, cannabinoids, and cocaine. So she may have been doing something in a pipe.
Yeah, probably.
She denied being sexually active or being sexually assaulted, which really doesn't make sense, but she refused to have a pelvic exam. They did do some sexually transmitted disease tests, which were all negative.
Well, it's kind of tough to deny being sexually active or sexually assaulted if you're nude from the waist down.
I know, it's just so sad.
So there was a CFS worker who stayed with Tina until she was discharged. Tina told her that she wanted a bike because she had lost hers. She said that a friend of hers, Sebastian, also known as Frenchie and also known as Raymond Cormier, was going to find one for her. Tina said Sebastian was a 62-year-old guy who was a meth user, but she just liked to hang around and chill with him. And even though she tested positive for amphetamines, Tina denied using meth with Sebastian.
Yeah, I think that toxicology test and then the condition of her lips tell a different story.
You would think.
I think so. So Tina's Child and Family Services worker contacted the police to let them know that Tina was at the hospital, so they went ahead and just canceled the missing persons report. Like, okie dokie, I guess we're okay now.
Well, yeah, she's not missing anymore.
Now, approval for a hotel room for Tina was requested, so Tina was discharged from the hospital with the worker and taken to a hotel around 5 p.m. Then Tina told the worker she wanted to meet some friends, and the worker said that's not a good idea. Tina said she would return to the hotel by midnight. So the worker told her she shouldn't go out, but then kind of caved and told her, well, make sure you come back to the room by 11 p.m., then left the hotel. Now, there was some kind of home worker who was supervising Tina, but allowed Tina to leave alone that evening.
Incredible.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
So this is something that will become a big issue, placing children in a hotel room. It's just not proper placement.
So Tina didn't get back the next day either.
No, so she left the hotel and was just gone.
Yeah. And over the weekend, there was no documentation made of any efforts to locate her. There was a be on the lookout in place. Then on Monday, August 11th, there were anonymous texts received by the police reporting that the person writing the texts had seen Tina on Ellis Avenue at 4 in the morning on Saturday, August 9th. The text said that Tina was walking down the street with a man.
Well, the police were able to figure out that the number the text came from belonged to an 18-year-old Indigenous girl named Katrina. She had grown up in CFS Care 2, and she was looking out for other girls that were on the street. So Katrina had met Tina on August 7th, and Tina told her she was 16 and working the streets. Tina led Katrina to a house on Furby Street and told her to wait for her while she ran inside. Then a few minutes later, Tina came out with a small baggie of marijuana. The girls were together until 2 a.m. when Katrina asked Tina to please go with her to a youth shelter a short walk away. What she told Tina was that they could get some food and use the bathroom, but Katrina really wanted Tina to spend the night there. She was really worried about her. So this was when she went to the shelter and tried to check in as Tessa Guimond. So according to Katrina, Tina refused to stay at the shelter, and the two girls walked back to a corner, and Tina told Katrina that her marijuana had been laced with something, and she was starting to hallucinate. Katrina stayed with Tina until close to sunrise. Then a dark truck pulled over and waved to Tina. She walked over and hopped right in. So Katrina saw a police car follow the truck, and she was relieved by that. She thought, well, at least Tina will get help. But this was the truck that was pulled over with the drunk driver, and these were the officers who let Tina walk away alone.
And so during his investigation, Detective O'Donovan found the officers who had done that traffic stop. They said, oh, Tina looked mature. And anyway, it was light out by then. They didn't think she was in any danger, so they let her walk away at 6 in the morning. They had checked Tina in the system for warrants, but had failed to check missing persons reports. So O'Donovan was understandably quite pissed off about their incompetence. These two officers eventually got fired from the police department.
Well, yeah, because remember, just a few hours after they let her go, she was found probably raped and probably OD'd in an alley, half naked.
Yeah.
So I hope they feel good about that, those fuckers.
Then August 11th and 12th, Tina's CFS worker had contacted several of Tina's relatives looking for her. Nobody could help. A media release with a photo of Tina was issued through the Canadian Centre for Child Protection. And by August 15th, Tina was still missing. The youth center and Tina's grandma were contacted. Neither of them had any idea where she was. So the Winnipeg police issued citywide bolos for Tina.
Well, after Tina's death, O'Donovan and his team of detectives were really working to try and put together a timeline of Tina's final week. A call came into the tip line from a man who was living at a halfway house, and he wanted detectives to interview him in person. He said he had information to share regarding Tina Fontaine. So this was a guy named Robert Sango. He was a former bank robber, an older guy in his 60s, and he was sitting outside at a bus stop at 10 p.m., on Wednesday, August 6th, when a young girl matching Tina's description ran around the corner to a payphone. He saw her make a short call and hang up the phone. Then she walked over to him and asked for a cigarette. He said he joked with her a little, saying she was too young to be smoking, and then she just burst into tears. She sat beside him on a bench and told him what was going on with her, and she introduced herself as Tina. Now he remembered that because when she said Tina, he said, "Oh, like Tina Turner," and she had no idea who that was. She said that she'd been hanging out with the girl and her boyfriend at their house earlier that evening. Then the couple went upstairs and left her with this older man, and he started coming on to her and becoming aggressive. He called her a whore then. She said that the man had stolen a truck and that she had run to the payphone to report this to the police. And now she was afraid that the man was following her. So when she walked away from Sango, the man and his friend had told her that they'd watch out for her. They'd watch down the street to make sure no one was following her. So they watched her walk all the way down Main Street and didn't see anyone. They didn't see the truck behind her. But then it was on August 18th when Sango saw Tina's picture in the newspaper that she was the girl who had been found in the Red River, and that's when he called the police to report the sighting of her and his interactions with her.
Oh, so O'Donovan had the phone records checked from the payphone that Tina had used. He found that there was a 911 call made from the phone at 10:18, the night of August 6th. They were able to listen to the call. It turned out to be a short call. Tina could be heard in her childlike voice reporting that a guy named Sebastian had stolen a blue truck. So this call was played for a relative of Tina's, and this person identified it as her voice. So now we're back to Sebastian, the 62-year-old meth user. Not only had he stolen a truck, he had promised her a bike, and he had tried to have sex with her. So he's definitely a person of interest.
Yeah, Tina's boyfriend Cody was interviewed, and he recognized the name Sebastian right away. He had actually known him. He said they had met the first time in mid-July. It was early in the morning, and he and Tina were walking down the street. Then all of a sudden, an older guy with long salt and pepper hair rode past on a bicycle, and he was hard to miss because he was carrying a car muffler over his shoulder.
Yeah, you probably wouldn't miss him.
No. So Cody had yelled to the man that they were lost. Then he stopped beside Cody and Tina, and he told them that he was Sebastian and he was a scrap metal collector. He said that he had a place where they could stay for the night in an empty basement of an apartment building. And he held up a screwdriver and said, "I have the keys to the city." So that night he pried open a basement door where there were some old blankets for them to sleep on. Then the next morning he had to return to let them out, and he gave them $20 for breakfast. So he's definitely trying to groom her from the beginning, I would say.
Sure sounds like it, right?
Yes. Why else would he do that?
Well, it wasn't out of the goodness of his heart.
No, I doubt it.
So after that, they hung out with Sebastian a lot of times over the summer. He's always on the lookout for metal or copper wire, anything he could sell for cash. One night, they followed Sebastian to a house near the Red River, and this was near where Tina's body was later found. He had a tent in the yard, which he said was his home. And he had metal and blankets and bottles of pills in the tent. So Cody was able to take the detectives to the house where Sebastian's tent had been. The tent was still there. Then when the detectives returned to interview the occupant of the house, who was Tracy Beardy, she didn't recognize the name Sebastian. But after a short description, she said, "Oh yeah, I know that guy, that's Frenchie." Tracy had met Frenchie in a donut shop when she used to work there. She and her mom felt sorry for him, and they let him stay in the family's tent. He had been at the house since July, but then someone stole his bike, and he destroyed her barbecue with a hammer. She hadn't seen him since then, which was okay with her, because as she tells the story, she didn't like the way he was looking at her 15-year-old daughter.
So there's a big red flag.
Well, yeah, but this is all after the fact. Come out sooner. Anyway.
Right. Well, she felt sorry for him, but, he was clearly a big meth head and a pedophile. So following up with the information given to them by Tracy, 2 detectives went to a scrapyard, where a woman at the front desk recognized their description of Sebastian as a man named Raymond Cormier. They ran the name through the police database, and they did find a mugshot of him, so he did have a history. So Cormier was homeless. He had been arrested and imprisoned several times over the years. Many of his offenses were violent, including robbery and assault with a weapon. All in all, he had 92 convictions on his record. So footage of a suspicious truck in the early hours of August 10th led detectives to believe that Cormier had used that stolen truck to transport and dispose of Tina's body. Tina had been seen midday Saturday, August 9th, and no one had seen her after that. Her body was recovered wearing the clothes she had worn on that day. If she was dumped in the river in the early hours of Sunday, August 10th, that would also fall in the time of death estimate made by the pathologist. So an alert was put out about the dark blue truck being stolen in the city, and a landscape gardener called to say that his Ford F-150 had been stolen with gardening equipment in the bed. Now, he would like that because there's a lot of metal, right?
Right.
On September 17th, a patrol officer called to say that the stolen truck had been found abandoned, the driver's window had been broken, and a man with blood on his hands had been witnessed wandering around that truck. But now Cormier is at large. They don't know where to find him.
But he was found. And there was another call to the tip line. So he tried to escape the police on his bike. That wasn't working, so he got off the bike, threw the bike at an officer, and ran down an alley. But he got caught. When he was taken into custody, he offered to tell him everything he knew. But he insisted that he had nothing at all to do with Tina's death. But one witness told detectives Cormier had told him he had had sex with Tina. He claimed that Tina was 18. Then a few weeks after that, witnesses had seen Cormier fighting with Tina. The argument had something to do with a dark-colored F-150 truck, but it had also been about something else. Tina had run out of the house because Cormier was creeping her out. He was coming on to her, looking for sex.
Yeah, so throughout the investigation, several witnesses remembered Cormier coming on to Tina and having some heated arguments with her. There were 2 witnesses who also recognized the duvet cover Tina's body was found in as something belonging to Cormier. According to Tracy Beardy and her daughter, he bought all of his blankets at Value Village, and that one had not been seen since the summer. August, to be specific.
Interesting.
So unable to get a confession and really having no evidence in the stolen truck, O'Donovan put together a plan for a Mr. Big undercover strategy.
Mr. Big. This is like, what, the 3rd episode we've done with a Mr. Big undercurrent?
At least, yeah. So all Mr. Big stings are pretty much the same.
Yeah, there's an undercover officer. They're all undercover, but one of them has what seems to be a chance meeting with the suspect, and eventually confides to the suspect that he's part of an organized crime gang. And as they slowly built up trust, the big boss is brought in. And this big boss confronts the person, in this case Cormier, with details of Tina's murder. Tell him if he confesses, the gang's going to be able to protect him from prosecution. And if he didn't confess, he would be led to believe that his status in the gang would be in jeopardy. So if Cormier was guilty, the confession would be forthcoming. You know, it's all built on, okay, we're appealing to your sense of greed, and you can be a part of this gang where you'll make tons of money. You just got to confess to things and make it right so we can take care of you and protect you.
Yes, but I also think it's a recipe for getting a false confession in many cases.
Well, we think so.
So I don't know if it's the best idea. Although O'Donovan felt confident that Cormier was guilty and the Mr. Big plan would work, this was a long and expensive operation, and many Mr. Big confessions have been overturned. Mr. Bigs are actually illegal in the U.S. and the U.K. and all of Europe, where they're seen as coercion, and I can see why.
Yeah.
But he did get permission to carry it out. It was going to cost about $200,000. So the Mr. Big plan, it was carried out. O'Donovan and his team believed that Cormier had confessed to them, but his statements were kind of vague, because he would make comments about killing Tina or other women, but he never did make a really coherent, complete confession.
No. In December of 2015, Cormier was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in Tina's death. Many rallies, vigils, and marches were organized all across Canada in Tina's name. A push was made for a national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Then, in September 2016, the federal government opened the national inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women under the Federal Inquiries Act.
Yeah, and Raymond Cormier went to trial in January of 2018. It really wasn't a strong case. The evidence against him was circumstantial or witness testimonies. Witnesses testified about the duvet being recognized as one of his, but, it couldn't be verified as specifically belonging to him in any way. One problem for the prosecution was that forensic analysis of Tina's body and clothing was really impossible, due to the amount of decomposition and the effects of being in that warm water for a long time. Fibers from the duvet and unknown fibers found with Tina's body gave them no DNA evidence. Dr. Dennis Ree testified that he found no definitive injuries on her body, so there was no evidence of a sexual assault, no indications of a stabbing or blunt force trauma. The medical examiner was unable to determine the exact cause of Tina's death. So these are all problems, serious problems with the case.
They sure are. So it was estimated that Tina's body had been in the river from anywhere from 3 to 7 days. This was based on the condition of her body and the last time she'd been seen by any witnesses. There's no evidence that she drowned, but they couldn't rule that out either. Christopher Ketty from the RCMP Forensics Lab testified that tests showed Tina's body had a level of alcohol slightly above the legal limit for driving. He also said there was a fairly high level of THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana. There was no evidence of gabapentin, but Ketty said the test the RCMP lab ran might not detect low levels of the drug.
Yes, I guess that was a thing that a lot of the people did in that area, gabapentin. They would take large amounts of it. What is it actually made for in a medical sense?
Seizures.
So it can knock you out in high doses.
Sure.
So under cross-examination, the defense said it couldn't be ruled out that gabapentin was in Tina's system at a potentially lethal level if it was combined with other drugs.
Right. Nothing in error about that statement. So then there wasn't any DNA evidence either that linked Cormier to Fontaine. That's a big problem. There were witnesses who testified that they'd seen Tina arguing with Cormier in the street on August 6th. And they heard Cormier mention something about a river in this argument. One woman who heard the argument testified that she heard Tina tell Cormier she was going to call the cops. So this could mean that Cormier was worried that Tina was going to report that he'd stolen the truck, which could be a motive for her murder.
It could be, but it's not very strong.
It sure isn't.
The jury heard the audio recording of Tina's call to 911 to report the stolen truck, and witnesses also testified that Tina was angry that Cormier had stolen her bike for drugs. So Cormier had admitted to the argument in an interview with police and said he had followed her down the street before turning in the other direction. He said that was the last time he saw her. Then he also suggested the suspect police should look for was a man he saw who looked like Led Zeppelin's lead singer Robert Plant and who was walking in the same direction as Tina that night. "Don't focus on me," he told police.
Then towards the end of the trial, the Mr. Big tapes were played. Cormier had been put into a bugged apartment rent-free, and an undercover officer moved into an apartment on the same floor. Cormier's apartment had been recorded continuously. He was recording that he'd bet the girl was killed because he found out she was only 15 years old. "I drew the line and that's why she got killed," he said.
So, this guy was on drugs and didn't make a lot of sense half the time.
Yeah, I'm not even sure why you want to do a Mr. Big sting. This guy's a mess.
Well, I think that Detective O'Donovan was just obsessed with getting justice for this case. He was really affected by it. What they did is they had an undercover officer move into the apartment on the same floor who became very friendly with him. And they even went as far as to have another undercover officer play the first officer's girlfriend and had them have a fight where it made it look like he had murdered the girlfriend. And then they got Cormier to give advice on how to get rid of the body and tried to use that against him.
Huh. That's pretty subtle. Jesus.
I know. It's just I understand where they're coming from, and I think it's a valiant effort, but it just wasn't going to work.
No.
And he was smart enough not to really say anything that would be directly incriminating. With all his interviews with police after his arrest, he just constantly denied it.
Yeah, Cormier had told a woman that when he last talked to Tina, he told her to go jump off a bridge. And now, you're just kind of scrambling around for anything that you could use against him, right?
Yeah, because he says all these wild things.
Yeah. Then another time, Cormier asked a woman if she had ever been haunted by something, and this was just before he started talking about Tina, and bragged that he had gotten away with 2 murders. Then there was a time of an argument. Cormier told a woman that there was a little girl in a grave someplace screaming at the top of her lungs for me to finish the job. And guess what? I finished the job.
Yeah.
Then he also warned people in his apartment not to overdose or they could end up wrapped in a carpet and thrown into the river.
But that doesn't work as a confession to what was done to Tina.
No, and he never made a solid confession to killing Tina.
No, and like I said, he was often just out of his mind on drugs and not making sense. He had a very severe meth addiction to the point of injecting it.
Prosecutor's overall argument contended that Cormier killed Tina either by suffocation or drowning because he found out she was only 15, and his attraction to her or his rape of her made him a pedophile. So the prosecution said that Cormier's words on the undercover tapes should be enough to convict him. The defense said there's no DNA evidence, no cause of death. There's just an overwhelming amount of reasonable doubt.
Yeah, the defense claimed that Cormier felt guilty after learning that Tina was only 15, and he wanted to find her real killer. The Mr. Big operation was an attempt to get a confession, which never happened, and they said that was because Cormier was innocent. So they argued that without a determination on the cause of death, it can't be known for certain that Tina died as a result of an unlawful act even. So Cormier should be acquitted on that argument alone. So after a 3-week trial with close to 50 witnesses, and the defense called forth no witnesses, Cormier was found not guilty. And of course, many people were outraged by this verdict, including Tina's grandma. They saw getting him convicted would be a way to get some justice. But I'm not so sure that he did it. He certainly could have, but we just don't have any proof.
Well, I could take the tack that he could be guilty or likely guilty, but there's not enough evidence to make that case.
Well, and unfortunately, the life she was living just put her in the path of a lot of bad people. So within minutes of that verdict, Manitoba Indigenous leaders criticized government systems for not protecting Tina Fontaine. Carolyn Bennett, Federal Crown Indigenous Relations Minister, tweeted, "Tina's is a tragic story that demonstrates the failures of all systems for Indigenous children and youth on every level. We need to fix this." And true that.
Yeah, what have they done?
Well, there's been a lot done as far as assessments and trying to get together information. I don't know if a lot's been done to stop it. One day after the trial ended, more than 1,000 people marched in Winnipeg to honor her and offer support to her family and the community. Then, in March of 2018, Crown prosecutors announced they would not appeal. Also in March, the Canadian government announced that $350,000 would be invested in Winnipeg to add a safe space that would be open 24 hours to offer shelter, food, and support to youth. So that sounds like a great idea, but you're going to have to keep funding it.
Yes, you are.
That's the thing. In Tina's memory, this space was named Tina's Safe Haven, and it did open up in November of 2018. So that could be helpful.
An assessment of Tina's case was done by the Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth. That was completed in March of 2019. They came up with recommendations to provide a safe and healthy society that values and protects children and young adults. The evidence that was put together exposed gaps in the public services. They were also not proactive, but reactive. Well, yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
One example of this was the trauma counseling services that Tina was entitled to receive after her father's death that were never provided.
Well, right. I mean, that's the ones that were like 70 kilometers away.
Yeah.
And then there was a waiting list for anything closer. That's just not helpful.
Nope. And then caseworkers didn't recognize that Tina's time as a missing person put her at high risk for sexual exploitation, harm, or death. So she wasn't given immediate or appropriate placements.
Well, yes. But I'm not sure if you can really just put that on the caseworker's shoulders of not recognizing it. I mean, they were limited to what they had available.
Yes.
Aside from taking her home with you, there isn't all that much they could do all the time. But the assessment did identify really poor coordination between the school, the Department of Child Family Services, and the police. This report found that Tina was repeatedly failed by the systems that were supposed to protect her. And this is like a 120-page report. This is just fascinating reading. I would recommend it to anybody. You can find it online. So Tina's younger sister, Sarah, who had lived with Tina and her grandma since they were little, got pregnant after Tina's death. And Sarah and Tina's cousin, Tina Fontaine, was shot and killed in her home shortly after that.
Jeez.
So it still goes on. It's generational. It's family-wide. It's a real problem. It's just too bad that there was really no evidence to get a conviction, because I can really understand how the community would be upset that he was found not guilty. And I understand that a lot of time and money was put in trying to get a conviction. But what they needed was just not there. I couldn't have found him guilty based on that evidence.
No, it was too flimsy.
Although certainly a scumbag. No question about that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But we have to look at why she was put in a position that she could be exploited by people like that, why she wasn't protected. I think that's what we really have to look at, because there are always going to be bad people out there. We can't eliminate the bad people. We have to protect the young people. So our sources for this case are a wonderful book by Joanna Jolly titled Red River Girl, and that report I was telling you about. It's titled A Place Where It Feels Like Home, and that's something that Tina had said about where she wanted to be placed. And that was written by Manitoba Advocate for Children and Youth, and that report came out in March of 2019. TCB's music was written and produced by Tristan Capel. To hear more of Tristan's music, just visit tristancapel.com. If you enjoy our podcasts, we'd really appreciate it if you'd take a few minutes to leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to the show. Also, the next time you find yourself in the market for a t-shirt, a mug, a tote bag, a hoodie, anything with our logos on it, we'd love it if you'd check out our store on our website, tiegrabber.com. Then you can get yourself something to show off your TCB affiliation. I mean, that's really something to be proud of.
It sure is.
We have a really big selection of merchandise through TeePublic, and we don't talk about it much, but it's something we're proud of, and we really would encourage you to check it out. The products are super reasonably priced and really good quality. We've tried them out, the t-shirts, the sweatshirts, everything. It is good quality, and it's pretty cheap. So let's move on to our feedback segment now. If you have comments on a case, or you'd like to suggest a case for us to cover, please send us your feedback to truecrimebrewery@tiegrabber.com, or even better, leave us a voicemail on our website, tiegrabber.com.
Yeah, so the feedback, I've got a whole pile of voicemails. So I picked two of them for us to talk about today. For Anna and Penny and Kimberly, thanks for your voicemails. I've sent you an email about those.
So our first voicemail is from Debbie.
Yes, she has a case suggestion.
Great.
Hi, Dick and Jill. It's Debbie calling from Montreal. I've called before, and you graciously covered a piece that I recommended, the William Sanderson piece, the med school student who killed his buddy over a drug deal in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Anyway, my new suggestion is a story about a man named Bruce Macarthur, and he was a landscaper in Toronto, Canada. And he hired sort of a string of young men to help him in his landscaping business, and then ultimately killed them all and put their body parts in planters and gardens all around Toronto. really gruesome story. Don't know that there's a lot of resources on it. There was one podcast that I heard. I think the CBC did it. Anyway, just a suggestion, and I love listening to your stories, and I hope you're staying healthy and safe in New Mexico. Bye for now.
Thank you, Debbie. We hope you're staying healthy and safe as well. And Debbie is known for giving some good recommendations.
She has done that for us, and she also lives in Montreal, one of my favorite cities in the whole world.
And we'd be there, except it's so fucking cold.
Coldest I've ever been.
Yep.
So she said Bruce Macarthur was a Canadian landscaper. He was found guilty of murdering 8 men. He dismembered them. He kept their remains in planters, as Debbie said. He especially liked gay Asian or Middle Eastern men. He is proven to be the most prolific serial killer in the Toronto area and the oldest serial killer. I don't know if that's a good thing or not.
Well, I don't think any kind of serial killer is a good thing.
He's the oldest one.
All right. Nothing to be proud of.
Nope.
So if he's putting body parts in planters, are these at different people's houses that he's landscaping?
Yeah.
Wow.
No.
Yuck, huh?
Yep.
Well, what if you were looking outside at the landscapers one day and you saw him put a leg in a pot?
Well, I think that they were already there.
Oh, he brought the planters they already had the body parts in them?
Sure.
Okay.
Otherwise, how's he going to do that?
I don't know. I don't know how it's done. It's a new one for me.
Yeah, I'm going to look into that. It sounded interesting.
Sure. Okay, our next case suggestion is from Karen.
Hello there, Dick and Jill. I hope everything's going well for both of you. This is Karen Stevenson from Canada, from Toronto. I was just wondering if at some point in time it might interest you to look into the case. Do you remember the story written by Vincent Bugliosi, And the Sea Will Tell? You probably have both read that. That was an absolutely fascinating story. I think there was a mini-series done on it many years ago, too. Yeah, James Brolin was in it, I remember. Anyhow, I think that might be a really fascinating case for you if you might decide to look into that further. Anyhow, it was just a spark of an idea I thought I'd call about. Thanks a lot. Take good care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Karen. Yeah, always if you have an idea, call. We love to get voicemails.
We do.
And Karen, you have an amazing voice. It's so sweet and soothing. I wish you would do a podcast because I would fall to sleep to that voice at night. It's a very sweet voice, and it kind of reminds me of Anne Rule. Remember hearing interviews with Anne Rule? A very similar voice.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, Karen gives us more credit when she kind of assumed that we've already read the book. I hadn't. I don't know if you have, Jill.
I may have, but I don't remember much about it if I did.
Well, it's a pretty interesting story. It's a couple, husband and wife, that were sailing. I don't know if they were sailing around the world or what. They ended up on this atoll, Palmyra Atoll, in the South Pacific. It's like 1,200 miles south of Hawaii. And they were planning on stopping there for some time, just the good life.
Yeah.
So, and they made friends with people there, and one couple that they met was Buck Walker and his girlfriend. And he turns out to be the murderer in this whole story. Girlfriend was acquitted. Sounded interesting, so I thought I'd look into that some more.
It sounds like something you might see on that true crime show. What was it called? Something in the Deep or something, where they did only cases of people who were out on the ocean on boats.
Yeah, sailing.
Something, but scary stuff. I guess maybe it's because my fear of being out in the middle of the ocean. I don't know what it is, but I find those kinds of stories fascinating and haunting. So I definitely will get that book and read it. Let you know what I think.
Yeah, we got to check that out.
Yes, absolutely.
All right.
So we have one email today, and this is from Cindy. It's a case suggestion. Cindy writes, I'm reading the book Evil Twins by John Glatt and have read that book before, but downloaded it off BARD, Braille Audio Reading Download Service. These have such cases as Greg and Jeff Henry, who are twins. Jeff kills Greg because of how he was treated through the years, a bully to his brother. Again, the book name is Evil Twins. All right, Cindy. We will definitely look that up because Cindy has given us a lot of case suggestions.
Cindy's a frequent contributor, and she has some spot-on instinct of cases that would interest people.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Cindy.
So I think we'll take Cindy's advice and look into this. The other thing I would mention, the author of this book, John Glatt, is the author of the book we're looking at for the bonus episode this month about David Camm.
Oh, he wrote that book?
He wrote that book.
He didn't like David Camm.
He did not like David Camm.
But a good book. Well written.
Yeah, so we'll look for this. Thank you, Cindy.
It's so funny because if I go to my Kindle and they say books recommended for you, it's all murder.
Yeah, I know. It's horrible. It's like,
yeah, it's all I read anymore.
We don't read anything else.
No, not really. Okay, you ready to wrap things up, Dick?
Let's leave our quiet place.
Yes. Well, thanks everyone for listening. We really appreciate it. Stay healthy. Take care of yourselves. Stay home when you can.
Wear a mask when you're out.
Okay, now we've told them we're like their mother.
Yeah.
Call your mother.
You never call.
Yeah. Okay, we will see you next time at the quiet end.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.